It's February 1896, and inside a war tent in northern Ethiopia, an Italian general named Oreste Baratieri is holding a telegram he just received from Rome. The message is pretty clear. Attack the Ethiopian army. There's just one problem. Baratieri doesn't think that's a very good idea, and neither do his officers. Their supplies are running low, their maps of the area aren't exactly great, and they don't even have a clear picture of what they're about to march into. So Baratieri has a choice. He can stay where he is and risk losing his command, or he can follow Rome's orders and attack. Now, you might be wondering what an Italian army was doing in Ethiopia in the first place. Well, let's explain that. It all started 7 years earlier in 1889, when Italy and Ethiopia signed a treaty in a town called Wuchale. Normally, both sides sign the treaty, shake hands, and that's pretty much it. Except this time, somebody didn't translate it right. Ethiopia had a version written in Amharic, Italy had a version written in Italian, and the two versions didn't actually say the same thing. The problem was Article 17. In the Ethiopian version, Emperor Menelik II could use Italy when dealing with other countries if he wanted to, but in the Italian version, he had to, which might sound like a tiny difference, but you know how politics are? Everybody interprets things differently, especially when there's something to gain. And Italy had quite a lot to gain, because they interpreted their version to mean that Ethiopia was now basically an Italian protectorate, which basically means Ethiopia could still have its own ruler and government, but Italy would control its relations with other countries. Menelik definitely didn't see it that way. Italy, meanwhile, didn't exactly wait around to see if he agreed. They went to the other European powers and announced that Ethiopia was now an Italian protectorate, basically telling everyone, don't deal directly with Ethiopia anymore, you deal with us. As you can imagine, Menelik wasn't particularly happy when he found out. He made it clear that Ethiopia had never agreed to become an Italian protectorate and demanded that Italy drop the claim. Italy, of course, refused to back down, so Menelik tore up the treaty. Now Italy had a decision to make. Menelik had rejected their claim, torn up the treaty, and made it pretty clear that Ethiopia wasn't interested in becoming an Italian protectorate. Italy could have accepted that and moved on, but apparently that option wasn't very popular. Instead, they decided they were going to enforce their claim, and at first, they had plenty of reasons to believe they could actually do it. Like most European powers at the time, Italy didn't exactly have a very high opinion of an African army. They expected Ethiopia to be divided, poorly organized, and relatively easy to defeat. There was just one problem with that assumption. Menelik had been preparing. Menelik hadn't just been sitting around, waiting to see what Italy would do. He started bringing Ethiopia's regional rulers together, including men who normally weren't exactly best friends, and somehow got them to put their differences aside long enough to deal with the Italians. Then came the weapons. Ethiopia had been buying modern rifles and huge amounts of ammunition, much of it from European suppliers, so the army Italy was preparing to fight wasn't the spear-carrying force they seemed to be imagining. By the time Menelik mobilized, tens of thousands of Ethiopian soldiers had modern rifles. His wife, Empress Taytu, even raised her own force and joined the campaign herself. Then, in December 1895, the two sides met at a place called Amba Alagi, where an Ethiopian force attacked an Italian position and almost completely wiped it out. Italy probably should have taken that as a warning, that their intelligence about Ethiopia was wrong, and that the army they were fighting was a lot more organized and dangerous than they had expected. But instead, Rome saw the defeat as an embarrassment that needed to be fixed. And the man who wanted it fixed was Italy's Prime Minister, Francesco Crispi. He had spent years trying to turn Italy into a serious colonial power, and now his army was getting beaten by the same country Italy had claimed was supposed to be its protectorate. Not exactly a great look. So Crispi started putting pressure on General Baratieri to do something about it. He wanted a victory, and he wanted one soon. And that brings us back to General Baratieri, sitting in that war tent with the telegram from Rome telling him to attack. By now, the situation wasn't exactly looking great. Italy had already underestimated the Ethiopians once. Baratieri's supplies were running low, his maps weren't reliable, and his own officers weren't convinced an attack was a good idea. But Crispi wanted his victory, and Baratieri knew that if he refused to give him one, Rome could simply replace him with someone who would. So on the night of February 29th, Baratieri finally made his decision. They were going to attack. Now, one thing worth mentioning before they started moving, roughly half of Baratieri's army wasn't actually Italian. They were Eritrean askaris, colonial soldiers recruited and trained by Italy, serving under Italian officers. So when we talk about the Italian army at Adwa, a huge part of that army was actually made up of Eritrean troops. Baratieri's plan was to move during the night and catch Menelik's army by surprise before sunrise. On paper, that probably sounded reasonable. The problem was that to pull it off, thousands of men had to march through unfamiliar mountains in complete darkness, using maps they already knew weren't particularly reliable. Baratieri divided his army into 4 brigades. Albertone would move on the left, Arimondi through the center, Dabormida on the right, while Elena followed behind with the reserve. If everything went according to plan, the brigades would reach their positions before dawn and attack together. And for a plan that depended on everyone knowing exactly where they were going, things started going wrong pretty quickly. Around midnight, Albertone and Arimondi somehow ended up on the same narrow mountain track. Arimondi stopped to let Albertone move ahead, and, without really realizing it, the Italian army was beginning to pull itself apart. By sunrise, Albertone's brigade was isolated from the others and moving straight toward the Ethiopian positions. And this is where Italy's intelligence problem really came back to bite them, because Albertone wasn't marching towards some small Ethiopian force. Menelik had gathered tens of thousands of soldiers around Adwa, many of them armed with modern rifles, and now one isolated Italian brigade was walking straight toward them. The Ethiopians didn't need some complicated intelligence report to figure out what had happened. From their positions around Adwa, they could see that the Italian advance had broken apart and that Albertone was out there without the other brigades close enough to properly support him. So they went after him first. Albertone's men fought for hours, but they were facing a much larger Ethiopian force on their own, and eventually the brigade was overwhelmed. Except there was another problem for the Italians. The rest of their army was still scattered across the mountains, and before they could regroup, the Ethiopian forces moved on them too. With Albertone's brigade already collapsing, Menelik's forces turned toward Arimondi in the center. His brigade was supposed to be part of one coordinated Italian attack, but by now there wasn't much of a coordinated attack left. The Italians were fighting separate battles across the mountains. Communication between the brigades was a mess, and Baratieri was quickly losing control of the situation. Then there was Dabormida. His brigade had moved even farther away from the others, and by the time he realized just how bad the situation had become, getting back to the main Italian force wasn't exactly an easy option. Ethiopian forces eventually surrounded his position too, and now all 3 of Baratieri's attacking brigades were either being overwhelmed or forced back separately. Exactly the kind of situation his original plan was supposed to avoid. By this point, Baratieri wasn't really commanding an attack anymore. He was watching it fall apart, so he finally ordered what was left of his army to retreat. And if marching through those mountains at night had been difficult, imagine trying to get back through them with thousands of exhausted and panicked men, while the army that had just beaten you was still behind you. By early afternoon, what was left of the Italian army was retreating back through the same mountains they'd crossed just hours earlier. Except this time, it was daylight. The attack had completely fallen apart, and nobody was particularly worried about staying in formation anymore. The exact casualty numbers depend on which source you use, but even the more conservative estimates put close to half of Baratieri's army dead, wounded, or captured. And the Ethiopians hadn't exactly walked away untouched either. Several thousand of Menelik's men had been killed, with thousands more wounded, so this wasn't some easy victory for Ethiopia. They had paid heavily for it. And for some of the Eritrean askaris who were captured, losing the battle may not have been the end of it. Some accounts say Ethiopian forces treated them as traitors for fighting alongside the Italians, and that some prisoners had a hand and a foot cut off as punishment. It's one of the darker parts of what happened after Adwa, although the details vary depending on the account. When news of the defeat finally reached Italy, things went about as well as you'd expect. Baratieri was recalled, put on trial for his handling of the battle, and although he was eventually acquitted, his military career was basically finished. Crispi didn't do much better. The victory he'd been demanding from Rome had turned into one of Italy's worst colonial defeats, and within days his government collapsed. But for Menelik, beating the Italian army wasn't enough. Italy still had to officially give up the claim that had started this whole mess in the first place, and a few months later, that's exactly what happened. On October 26, 1896, Italy signed the Treaty of Addis Ababa, scrapped the Treaty of Wuchale, and formally recognized Ethiopia as an independent state. So, after 7 years, thousands of deaths, one destroyed Italian army, and a government collapsing back in Rome, they basically ended up right back where Menelik had told them they were at the beginning. Ethiopia was independent. All of this because somebody didn't translate a treaty properly. I'm Zombo. If you made it this far, you're already part of the quest. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.